All right, here's the plan. Today and Tuesday we'll talk about JavaScript. JavaScript, I would like those that are feeling comfortable with the material in the class to take a shot incorporating it, whether it be in their project or in the last assignment. Today and Tuesday we'll go over it, and Thursday I kind of want to leave open for an opportunity for folks to ask questions on their project and maybe more of an extended work period, and also a chance for you folks to showcase the stuff that you've been doing, to take a look at it and to share it. So we'll see how that goes. This is all subject to change, of course. All right. Now, let's go back and talk about what happens when someone requests a web page. All right. We have our client connected to the internet, and through that they connect to any number of web servers. Web servers are where your web pages live when they're completed. It's simply a system that is set up and is available to people to make requests to. It's anticipating requests. It has the software to listen for requests, to wait for requests. And so the requests come in, it can respond to them. Now, we talked about static and dynamic pages. All right? For the purpose of discussion today, that doesn't really matter much, whether we're talking about static or dynamic. So we'll keep it simple and just talk about sending back a static page, and we don't have to get into the whole business of what the server does. So we're just interested in the client making a request. It goes through the internet, makes it to the server, and comes back. All right. And delivered so far has been a document that consists of HTML, CSS, and whatever images or other files get sent. Now, a point to make here is keep in mind that typically both the client and the server are computers. Now, they might be a mobile device instead of a computer, but typically they're something that has some capability to do some processing, just as the server does. All right? The server, to be sure, is going to be doing the heavy lifting. Things such as database interactivity and that sort of thing is going to be done on the web server. All right? An important assumption is, that given the fact that both the client and the server are capable of processing code, all right, the amount of time it takes for the client to go through the internet, get something from the server, and get it back delivered is a very long time compared to how long it will take the client to execute some code that it already has. That's sort of the fundamental assumption, that even though from our perspective, we type in, if we're on a good internet connection, we type in google.com, it comes up pretty quick. Still, that process is a long time compared to the time that if the code's already loaded in the client, that the client machine can execute it. All right? So that's sort of our assumption, and this is sort of the reason for why we have something called client-side scripting or JavaScript code. So far, all the interactivity we've had on our pages have been really clunky. It has been in the form of either clicking a link or entering a form and pressing the submit button. In both cases, you're going to a web server. In its final form, it would be going to a web server and coming back. All right? That's a very clunky interaction. All right? Just take a look at clicking on any links. Even on a fast internet connection. I didn't want to do that. Even on a fast connection, let's say I click on this. That took a few seconds to happen. And for some kind of things like this, that's okay. We click something, we have to load a whole page. But there's other kinds of interactivity that we would hope we would be able to make work quicker than this. That is, we'll be able to make some interactivity work without us having to go through the whole ordeal of sending a request through the server and getting information back. An example of that would be something like mouse over effects. All right. Notice that as we put our mouse on these items, there's no apparent lag. I mean, as soon as I move my mouse to sports, let's say, it appears. As soon as I put it over tech and science, that appears. Likewise with home. All right. That kind of gives us a hint that this isn't going on, right? Because if this goes on, then that can take, depending on a number of variables, that can take a little bit of time, right? If your internet connection is slow, if there's generally a lot of traffic on the internet that day, sometimes like on big news days, or if there's like hackers doing a denial of service attack, or any number of things that can slow down your internet speed. Not to mention the fact that you might have a bad connection, The server on the other end may be busy. On a big news day, for example, most of the major news sites take a little bit longer to load because more and more people are hitting it. So this process could take a period of time, but it's pretty clear that this kind of mouse over effect is taking virtually no time at all. All right, so it's a different beast than the standard clicking on a link and loading up a whole page. And that's exactly where client-side coding comes from. All right, client-side coding, generally speaking, with client-side coding, the user gets set, in addition to the HTML and CSS and images and all that stuff, they get sent some JavaScript. And what is JavaScript? JavaScript is code that can serve a number of purposes, but probably the main purpose, if we're going to summarize it, is to say that it provides interactivity on a page. For the most part. Again, you can find exceptions, so I'm not saying exclusively. But JavaScript handles interactivity on a page. And it handles interactivity cleaner than simply clicking on a link and loading up another page. When you do that, regardless if you're talking about a static page or a dynamic page, you're asking the web server for a new page and it's giving you a new page back. In the case of JavaScript, that code is simply altering the page that's already been loaded. All right? If anything, that's the difference between server-side scripts, which we talked about before, and client-side scripts. Server-side scripts are responsible for generating web pages. Client-side scripts are responsible for changing, altering web pages. Now, to be sure, the kind of things that you can do in client-side JavaScript are limited compared to the stuff that you can do on a server. All right? You're not going to be interacting with a database through JavaScript, and you're not going to be interacting with a news service, probably not, and you're not going to do what I would call the heavy lifting of a web application. again, largely database interactivity. But you can definitely make some cosmetic changes to your page. All right? For example, this is a cosmetic change of the page, displaying a different menu. The interesting thing is, and we could look at the code, it would probably be very hard to read, but the thing is when I request this page, initially, I actually get all those menus. They're just hidden. And as I put my mouse over different spots on the page, the new menu gets hidden. Or, I'm sorry, not hidden. The new menu gets displayed. All right? So, that's done through JavaScript. We're changing the page. We're taking something that used to be invisible and make it visible. All right? A very classic example of JavaScript is this very thing. As you mouse over links, it shows up a submenu. Another one, let's see if we can find some sort of photo gallery with thumbnails. That one. That's that one. I don't have a good example here, but we've all seen them. Whereas you have a page with thumbnails, that is, smaller versions of a picture. And as you put your mouse over the thumbnail, the big picture in the center changes to show the one that you've put your mouse over. So pretty common thing. I can't, off the top of my head, think of one. And I don't feel like Google searching for it. So actually, believe it or not, both of these things, both the menus popping up and the thumbnails, are sort of very related. All right, there's very similar code in it. In both cases, we're changing some of the characteristics of the web page. All right. Now, we're going to focus on some simple JavaScript. All right. So we're not going to cover the breadth of JavaScript. So some of the comments I make are to be taken within the context of the JavaScript that we're covering in this class and not meant to represent every single thing about JavaScript. But if I talk about changing a page, which JavaScript does, what does that mean? For example, if I had an image on the page, and I wanted to manually change that image to be a different image, how would I manually make that change? I have an HTML document that has an image tag in it that shows a dog. I want to change it to show a cat. Change the what? Well, change the Src. Change the Src attribute to point to the new image. All right? In essence, that's what our JavaScript does. Our JavaScript can point to things on the page and change some of their attributes. Now, the two main kinds of attributes that it can change is it can change the HTML attributes, for example, the source of an image. It can also change the style attributes. So we could make something visible that used to be invisible, and so on. So that's sort of what we're going to be talking about when we talk about JavaScript, is using code to change attributes on the fly. All right. I'd like to define precisely interactivity. When you hear the word interactivity, what do you think of? What do you think of by interactivity? Repeat, please.
Something within.
Yeah, it is something within a site. does go on behind the scenes. If I pull up a web page, pull up the NBC News web page. Right now, are we seeing any interactivity? No, the page is sitting there. All right. Survey would be an example of interactivity, but I want to define more precisely interactivity. This is interactivity. So I guess when I talk about interactivity, what I mean is the user does something and the page responds back and changes somehow. That's what I mean by interactivity. All right? And that can happen in any number of different forms, but typically, for the most part, that's interactivity. You know, there's inner between the two parties, between the web page and the user, there's activity. User does something, page does something. User does something else, page does something else. And we see that in the mouse over and we see that in the thumbnails. All right? So, by interactivity, we mean that user does something and the page responds. User doing something is an example. Probably the more formal word for that is an event. An event happens. Now, what kinds of events? How do people interact with a web page? Typically, they interact either through the mouse or through the keyboard, right? So I could press a key, that's me interacting with it. I could click a mouse. I could move my mouse. All those things are me doing something on that web page. All right? And each one of those is called an event. And we can actually write JavaScript code to react to just about any of these events. There's a whole slew of events. We're going to focus on some of the most straightforward ones. But there's a whole slew of events that we could write code for. All right? So, user does something, typically with the keyboard or the mouse. All right? Those are events. The page responds. You know, what do I mean by respond? Does it say, hey, don't click there, or whatever? The page responds meaning the page changes some way. Again, keep in mind, I'm talking about this on an introductory level, and for the kinds of JavaScript we're going to talk about. You know, if you've done some JavaScript coding, you could probably find exceptions to some of the things I'm saying. Another way of saying the page changes is saying that some of the HTML attributes change, or some of the style attributes change. Because that's what we really mean when we talk about the page changing, right? When we talked about the image changing, what were we talking about? We were talking about the Src attribute changing. If we talked about a menu appearing, we're talking about something that used to be invisible, we're going to make visible. All right? So we're changing some aspect of the style. So we're going to be concerned with JavaScript that accomplishes this activity, which means that the user does something, these are known as events, and the page is going to respond. Now, the general flow is going to be like this. Oh, I think I leaned on this thing. All right. The general flow is going to be like this. We're going to, number one, create event handlers. We're going to decide what events we're interested in, and we're going to do something associated with those events. We're going to code something on those events. All right? Number two, there's the DOM. DOM stands for Document Object Model. And from the perspective of JavaScript, and when we talk about the DOM with reference to web page development interactivity, what the DOM is a way of referring to individual things on the page. All right? Let's consider our thumbnail example for a second. I have these three thumbnails, and I have this big image. I may have other images on the page, right? I may have an image up in my banner. I may have an image over here. I may have another image over here. But when I click on these thumbnails, this is the image I want to change. All right? Well, we better be sure that we can tell the right image to change. We don't want all the images to change. And we don't want this image to change, or this image, or any of these. We want this one to change. That's where the document object model comes in. The document object model allows us to point to particular things on the page and their attributes. So, we can point to that particular image, if this is the image that we want to change. We can point to that particular image and say, hey, that's the image we want to change. And what's more, what do I want to change about it? Do I want to change its size? Do I want to change its position? Do I want to change its border? Well, no in these cases. All right. What do I want to change? I want to change the actual source image, the file that is going to be displayed there. So that's the Src attribute. So the DOM allows us to point to elements and their attributes so that we can change them. Lastly, there is the JavaScript syntax that actually gets into the mechanics of, gee, how do you go and make that change, and what does a statement look like that's going to change the background image to something else. This is pretty straightforward. There's maybe 15 or so events, 20 events, I don't know, of that nature. And of those, there's probably a few that you use a lot, and then a few that you use maybe once in a while. But this in concept is pretty straightforward. This in concept is straightforward, but think of all the different things that we've done in this class. Fonts and sizes of fonts and position and background colors and all that. So to be able to manipulate those, that can be a little tricky. Not because it's hard in concept, but there's, it takes a little while to figure that one out. All right? The JavaScript syntax also takes a little while to figure out. So again, this is pretty straightforward. You have a pretty good grip on this through this class. These two are going to take time. We'll learn some simple stuff, but then, to go further, you'll have to learn more in both these areas. All right. What I like to do now, then, is take and create a little site or a little page that has some thumbnails and has a big image. Go out to Angel and download an example real quick. Okay, actually, I lied. We're going to start out with another example. We'll do the thumbnails after this one. We'll start with a little bit simpler example. All right. So here's the example that I want to do. Let's say we had a quiz. What are the 2 U.S. states that do not have daylight savings time? Any ideas? I think you're half right. I think these states are concerned that the extra hour of sunlight would ruin their curtains. All right. So there's 2 states that, and the answer is Arizona and Hawaii. All right. So we have a case of interactivity. We can go and we can show the answer, or we can hide it. I do something, the page responds back. I do something else, the page says something else. Let's look at the source code for this. Let's look at the code for this. All right. We'll see in this example sort of how the 3 elements, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, work together. All right. HTML being the content, CSS being the appearance, and JavaScript being the behavior, the interactivity, where we change the appearance or content of the page based on something the user does. All right. I have this as a link to #. I guess I could have done it some other way. All right. That way, if someone happens to click on it, it just reloads the page, just goes to the top of the page. So that's all that means. Now, the first thing that you notice is Onmouseover. And we also have Onmouseout. Those are 2 of the events that we can associate with an HTML element. The Onmouseover is code that we want to happen when the user puts their mouse on that particular item. The Onmouseout is a code that we want to do when the user takes their mouse off of that item. So, if we're viewing this, answer displayed, answer hidden. Mouse over, mouse out. We should get Mr. Miyagi to do this one. Mouse over, mouse out. All right. These events typically start with the word on. On mouse over means when the mouse is put over it, this is what we want to do. We could do a search and look at the other events, and they all start with the word on. Notice that these are HTML attributes. All right? In other words, this is part of the start link tag. Notice we have our link tag, href equals #, and there is a closing bracket for that link. These onmouseovers are attributes of that link tag. Notice that these events aren't coded on the thing that we're showing and hiding. They're coded on the thing that we want to interact with. All right? So in other words, what does the user interact with when they want to see the answer? They interact with that show answer link. So the onmouseover, onmouseout is coded to be on that link. All right? And not on that answer div. All right? So, right now we haven't looked at the details of that onmouseover or onmouseout. But again, it's an HTML attribute on the A link. And like any other attribute, there's the name of the attribute, an equal sign, and then enclosed in quotes is the value of that attribute. In this case, it's the JavaScript that we want to execute. Now notice how this works. Initially, all the content's in the HTML. The answer, or the question, the link that shows the answer, and the answer. But through our CSS, we've made the answer invisible. All right? We set the visibility properties. And again, until you learn JavaScript, there's really no point in even talking about the visibility property, right? Because why would you put something on your page if you're going to make it invisible? Well, unless you have some code that makes it visible under certain circumstances. So that's probably why we haven't seen that visibility property, if we haven't seen it. All right? So, if there was no JavaScript at all, then that answer would be invisible and it would stay invisible. Now, let's look at the JavaScript. And this might be a daunting instruction. But if we break it down, it's actually fairly simple. I say fairly simple the same way a dentist says that the root canal that you're going to have is going to be fairly simple. Yeah, it's easy for him. All right. Again, notice all of this is within a pair of quotes. So everything within the quotes is the JavaScript that we're going to do if the user places their mouse over that link. This part here is a DOM expression. What does a DOM do? It allows us to point to a particular element on the page, and it allows us to change one of its attributes. So, let's look at this one piece at a time, because really what we're doing is we're zeroing in on that exact thing that we want to change. All right? The word document means that the thing that we want to change is on our web page. Now that might sound goofy, but you could have other things there under some other circumstances. So the document says, hey, on this web page, there's something I want to deal with. I want to do something with. What is it that I want to deal with? I have to find it. All right? I have to point to it. This get element by ID is sort of a workhorse part of the DOM. It's something that you're going to use over and over again. Because what it allows us to do is to point to one specific thing on the screen. Remember, your IDs need to be unique. This is one reason. So that if you point to something, you're pointing just to that one thing. So what get element by ID does is it finds a thing on the page that has that ID. Well, what ID am I looking at? I'm looking at for the ID of answer. Note for now that answer is in single quotes. We'll come back to that. But we're looking for the thing on the page that has an ID of answer. Well, what has an ID of answer? This div right here. So what this part of the statement says is point to the thing on this page, point to the thing that has an ID of answer. All right? Because we're going to do something to it. What are we going to do to it? We're going to change its style. All right? What about the style are we going to change? We're going to change its visibility. What are we going to change the visibility to? We're going to change the visibility to visible. All right? How did I know visible? Well, that's one of the two properties of the visibility attribute. It's either, well, there's others as well, but for our purposes, it's hidden or it's visible. Now, you should notice a couple of things. All right? First of all, we're changing something in the style. So we have the word style there. It's not a coincidence that that style is the same as this style. All right? We're changing something about the style of the page. The other thing that's not a coincidence is that word visibility is exactly the same as this. Right? Because we're changing that attribute. It's not like we're going to call it something else. The browser knows the visibility attribute is being called visibility. So whether we define the CSS to make it visible or invisible, or write Java code to do it, we still refer to it as the style dot visibility. Style visibility. All right? And then finally, we're setting it to visible. The Onmouseout does pretty much just the opposite. We point to the same element on the page, we change its style, we change its visibility, except we set it back to hidden. So it does sort of the same thing in terms of pointing to the element, pointing at the style, pointing at the visibility. The difference is we're setting it to hidden instead of visible. All right. Now, a couple of things. And this is one thing that a lot of students find confusing. All right? So, if you don't get this at first, this might be something that you might struggle about a bit. All right? First of all, notice that I'm using two different kinds of quotes here. I'm using double quotes at the beginning and end of the Onmouseout event or Onmouseover event. That indicates the value of this attribute. That indicates all the JavaScript that I want to run when the user puts their mouse over this particular element. Now, if I need to use quotes inside the JavaScript statement, I have to use then single quotes. Why? Well, if I try to use a double quote here and here, let's say, the browser's going to think that this is the entire Onmouseover event. Because it sees the first quote, sees a little bit, sees a second quote, thinks, I'm done. That's the JavaScript I want to do. And of course, that's not the complete JavaScript, so it won't work. You'll get an error. So the way around that is the fact that we have two different kinds of quotes. So we start our JavaScript with a double quote. The browser, when it looks to see what the mouseover event is, hits and says, nah, that's not the ending quote for this. So I still continue until I hit the ending double quote. So we use that just to not have confusion between the quotes. The double quotes go on the outside and indicate that, hey, this is the beginning and end of the JavaScript that I want to do. If there's anything we need the quote for inside, we use the single quote then. Now, that begs the question, when do we put something in quotes and not in quotes? Well, that's something that's confusing. All right, and I'll do my best to try to explain it to you, but it takes a little practice and it takes a little time. First of all, this visible is in quotes because I actually want to set it to that word, the word visible. If I did not put quotes around it, it would think that there was a property or there was a variable or there was something else called visible. Sort of the same idea with answer. So for both of these, I want literally that word to be plugged in. All right? Document get element by ID. What ID do I want? That ID isn't contained in some variable named answer. It is answer. So I want exactly verbatim those lines. Why isn't document.getElement by ID in quotes then? Well, that's a command. So commands are not in quotes. All right. But values that could be different well, let me rephrase that. I don't like the way I said that. In this case, this is in quotes because we want that exact value answer. So sort of like values that we're going to hard code are in quotes, whereas parts of commands and DOM expressions are not in quotes. All right. I know that's a little confusing. For our purposes, you can kind of remember that when you do the document get element by ID, it's going to be in quotes, and the value that you assign to it is going to be in quotes. What this literally says is point to this property of that element and set that property to visible. All right? Questions? The Onmouseout does exactly the same thing except sets it to hidden. So even in a simple example, we've done all the things that we typically do in JavaScript. Right? We have our event handlers, the Onmouseout and Onmouseover. So we do that. We've written event handlers. We use the DOM, document.getElement by ID, answer, .style.visibility is pointing to a particular element of that page and one of its specific attributes. Then finally, we have some very simple JavaScript syntax to set the value of that to something else. Now, by extension, if you think about this, we can go crazy with this. We can change any aspect of the page. All right? For example, not that there is any use to this at all, but I could create a link here to change the color of the question. Not sure it's a useful link, but I could do it. Yes? Oh, because I don't really want to go to another page. I want to, if the user, this is just there to get the mouse over effect. So I don't really want to go to another page. So the pound sign, if someone were to click that, they'd simply reload the page.
So you do that every time
you do that if you want a link. All right? You do that if you want a link that doesn't really link anywhere. So like a dummy link, kind of, which effectively that's what this is. All right. Let's do this with a button. I changed my mind. And I'm going to use the plain old button. Remember we talked about just a plain old button. It's different than a submit button. It doesn't send it to the server. It just allows us to initiate some JavaScript. And I'm going to call this one button change to red. And I'm going to say on click equals all right, document. That's probably going to stay the same, right? Because the thing I'm changing is still on this page. Get element by ID. All right. I don't want to change the answer div. In this case, I want to change the question div. So I better go and give this div an ID so I can point to it. Well, let me change the question div. Let me change its style. And let me change its background color. Now, here's one thing where there is a little bit of difference. If I was to define a background color in CSS, I'd define it as background dash color white. All right. In JavaScript, though, little irregularity, all right, just to keep things interesting. We don't set it to background dash color. We set it to background color where the C is uppercased. So any of those style rules where there's a dash in the middle of them, you forget the dash and capitalize the next word. So I want to set it to red, let's say, if they click on this button. And let's go and let's create a change to white. All right. So yeah, change to red, change to white. Click that. Question becomes red. Click that. Change to white. All right. Again, even though the behavior is very different, the technique's the same, right? User event. User does something. We have an event handler that handles when the user does something, that does something in response when the user does something. In this case, in the links case, it's on mouse over. In the case of the button, we have an on click event. All right. We use the DOM to point to the thing that we want to change. In one case, we wanted to change one of the divs' visibility. In the other case, we wanted to change one of the divs' background color. All right. But still, the format of it is roughly the same. We use document get element by ID to point to the thing on the page that we want to change, and then we set that attribute equal to something else. Okay? So I'll bet if you tried, this might be a good experiment to try, and we'll go over it Tuesday. We'll go over an example of this. I'll bet if you thought about it, you might be able to figure out how to do a thumbnail and a bigger picture. All right? Let's talk about that for a second. We have 3 thumbnails. We have our big picture. We load this up with thumbnail 1, thumbnail 2, thumbnail 3. We initialize this to picture 1. What's going to be the user event? I'm probably going to have an on mouse over on mouse over on each of these buttons, right? Because the way I want my thumbnail to work, probably, I guess I haven't been really clear about that, but probably the way I want it to work is if I put my mouse over these things, that picture changes. So I have an OnMouseOver event handler on these three images. I won't have one on this because I'm not interested in what happens when I put my mouse on that image. I'm interested in what happens when I put my mouse over the thumbnails. Now, what do I want to do? Well, I want to use the document object model to point to that image. Well, that implies this image better have some kind of ID so that I can point to it. Finally, what property do I want to change? I want to change the Src property, right? Because that is the property that controls the file of the image. And what do I want to set it to? Well, in this case, I want to set it to 1.jpg. In this case, I want to set it to 2.jpg. In this one, I want to set it to 3.jpg. Again, assuming that my thumbnails are called T1, T2, T3, and my big images are called 1, 2, and 3. All right? So it should be pretty straightforward to go and take that and adapt it. So give that a shot. We'll review that on Tuesday. Final words. All right? Boy, that sounds morbid, right? The concluding words today in class, you know. Whereas CSS and HTML sort of just describe aspects of a document, JavaScript code is like full-blown programming languages, all right? Which is kind of dangerous because in HTML, if you like mess up a little bit, it's liable to be forgiving. In JavaScript, no forgiveness there, all right? No forgiveness there. And JavaScript is very particular, even to the point of being case sensitive. So if I said get element by ID with a capital D, that's not going to work. All right? So it needs to be a lowercase d. Now, we'll spend some time talking about techniques to debug next time and what happens if this doesn't work and all that. But as a cautionary thing, it needs to match perfectly. So if you're like looking at an example of the book or one of mine, you can't freeform type it in however you want. You have to follow the case of the instructions. All right. Yes?
Can you take talk about with the images and put it in a table? Like I have a plant and I want a picture of my plant and information. Can you do that where can you put those images in a table and have them mouse over so they can enlarge? Or do you normally not put images in the table?
I'm not sure exactly what you want to accomplish. The question is could you do a mouse over effect on an image in a table? The short answer is yeah, absolutely could. Sure, why not? All right. The longer answer is I'm not really sure what you're trying to accomplish with that. You know, we'd have to. We can spend some time talking about it to see if that's the best way to do that. All right, but yeah, you could do something along those lines. Question? All right, I'll post this example and we'll continue on this next time. Okay.